gives a fuck about an Oxford comma? By Great 78.
Who gives a fuck about an Oxford comma? I've seen those English dramas too. They're cruel. So if there's any other way to spell the word, it's fine with me. With me.
Chapter 22. Killing in the Name. Still Sunday evening, October 31st, 1991. Pegwater, Flat 307, Christchurch College, Oxford, England. Draco. It had been one of the best moments of his life so far, snogging Granger in their kitchenette flat, till Theo barged in and made it awkward. "Oh, gee," the dark-haired Slytherin said when he spotted them from across the flat. In an instant, Draco's arms were empty once again. "You win the alphabet game, Theo. Oh, gee, indeed," Granger said as she turned away, flicking off the insistent tea kettle. Her lovely copper eyes barely meeting his, she said to Draco, "I really need to study. We'll talk later, yes?" Did she regret it? Draco wasn't sure he could bear it if so, but should he have done that in the first place? As soon as Granger's bedroom door slammed, Theo raised his wand to cast a muffling charm. "Well, that was all very interesting," the wizard drawled. "Exactly what salacious tawdriness did I interrupt here?" Draco shook his head and leaned back against the countertop in the space that Granger had only recently vacated. I think I've just had too much to drink." His flatmate laughed. "Hermione didn't have a drop at dinner that I saw. Wonder what her excuse will be." Draco rubbed at his eyes, anxiety beginning to seep in. As much as he wanted her as his own, he should not have done that, kissing her like that. If she did have any sort of feelings for him, it could only end badly for her. Getting close to Draco would be playing directly into Shacklebolt's plans for the witch. "Don't bring it back up with her, mate. As for me, it's just been a long day, is all. I lost my head for a moment. Won't happen again." Theo gave him an upwards nod in recognition of that truth. "I should say it has been a long day. First the Minister for Magic stops in for a chin wag at daybreak. Then you make a date with a muggle bird over the telephone, speaking of which, pip-pip to you for figuring out how to use the thing correctly on your first try, by the way. After that you set off on a wander around Oxford with Harry Potter and the ginger who tagged along. And if that wasn't enough, I find you snogging Granger over the tea kettle." Draco inhaled sharply at the other man's words. "How did you know about that?" "Well, I was here for most of that, mate. You know I mean the Potter thing, Theo, don't be dense. I saw the three of you skulking around when the girls and I went for breakfast." Draco closed his eyes. "Oh. Are you still trying to claim there's nothing going on? I mean, Potter I can somewhat at least understand. The man's style leaves a lot to be desired, but he's halfway intelligent. However, if you are bringing in Weasley, the situation must be dire." Theo chuckled. Draco hesitated, then finally nodded at the dark-haired wizard. "I guess it is kind of dire. But, mate, no offense meant. I very much doubt at this point that you can help." "But how do you know I can't help if you won't tell me what the fuck is going on?" Theo nearly seethed. Draco's eyes flitted to Granger's door, making sure that it was still closed. He's got me watching her." "Who? Shacklebolt?" Theo's eyebrows drew together in confusion. At Draco's terse nod, he asked, "Why?" The simple answer? He's jealous of her, and he doesn't want her to become powerful. She's amazing, popular, intelligent. She's beloved by most of the wizarding world. Meanwhile, Shacklebolt is minister, only because a handful of insiders at the ministry and those amongst their order trusted him. He sees the writing on the wall, and he knows that if she ever wanted the job, They would give it to her in a heartbeat. Theo cocked his head in thought, then nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. That's probably true. Bloody hell. She most likely wouldn't even need to campaign for the job. If she said she wanted it, they'd probably offer it to her on a silver platter. So, what, then? Where do you come in? Draco could not meet his friend's eyes. When he first approached me at Hogwarts back in March, he told me he wanted me to keep an eye on her. Keep her occupied. It didn't seem so bad in the beginning, almost like I should observe her in a kind of a protective way. I could tell there was more to it, even then, but I suppose I believed what I wanted to believe. But then he rigged up this living situation for us. That was his interference. I assumed you must have made nice with Ketterlaus and somehow pulled the right strings to make this happen, Theo said, gesturing around at the minuscule flat that they'd managed to share with Granger under the most dubious of circumstances. No, if anything, the fact that Slughorn's letter to accommodations left off the Oxford comma and had my last name as Granger likely saved me. Honestly, I am fairly certain that the Ketterlaus clan will always carry a vendetta against the Malfoys. Since the recommendations letter had my surname as Granger, Ketterlaus likely never realized. Theo nodded sagely. That's true. Ketterlaus hates your family. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure he hates Tiberius as well, but you can always replace a wife. Losing a family fortune has got to be a heavy blow. I tend to disagree about the ease of replacing the wife part. Draco laughed, his head beginning to clear from his earlier drinks. But after that, Shacklebolt started threatening Granger and my mother, saying they could still be tried for crimes committed during the war. Then he began mucking up Granger's grades. Did you know she's failing all of her magical classes? And he's somehow tracking her movements, and now he's... But here Draco stopped, unwilling to say what Shacklebolt's latest harebrained idea had been. He hated even putting the thought into words, the idea of marrying Granger, only to clip her wings and paint her reputation with the dirty smear of the name Malfoy. As it was, Theo was standing ramrod straight, his anger palpable at Draco's litany of Shacklebolt's actions. Now he's looking for new and better ways to marginalize her, to stifle her influence. Permanently. He summed up. Theo shook his head angrily. I've got to say, from what I know about him, I'm not very surprised. He's always looked out for himself. Drake, I don't mean to sound dramatic, but he's not one to be crossed. I know, mate, Draco began, but he was cut off by his oldest friend, whose expression had turned quite serious, quite suddenly. No, I don't think you do know. Remember how I told you my mother had plenty of reasons for why she wouldn't let me stay with him during the war in order to complete school at Hogwarts? Theo asked. Draco nodded. Yes, I remember you saying something about that. Theo looked over his shoulder at Granger's door again, as though to satisfy himself that it was still closed. This doesn't leave this room, right? There's no proof of any of it, and there are certain people who would be pleased as punch to throw a Death Eater's son in Azkaban for making these kinds of accusations against the Minister for Magic. Of course, Draco said, his stomach giving a nervous flip at Theo's words. Truer words were seldom spoken, he thought. Well, you know I grew up good friends with Susan from Hufflepuff, right? Theo asked. Draco drew his brows together, thinking back to their youth. Yes, I'd nearly forgotten that. I remember playing with her at your house a time or two before your parents divorced, when we were all around 6 or so. The other wizard nodded. Right. Well, the reason I knew her was that Mum was good friends with Susan's father and aunt. They were brother and sister. Eugene Bones was in Slytherin in Mum's year, and his sister, Amelia, was a year ahead of them, sorted into Ravenclaw. Amelia was always a little rough around the edges in school, according to Mum, so she stuck close to her brother at Hogwarts, even though they were in different houses." Draco nodded. Theo was steadfastly watching the fire that Draco had built in the fireplace earlier, and Draco did not interrupt him. Despite the two of them being close friends for years, Theo seldom spoke about his mother. Evangeline Caris Knott had always been something of an interesting enigma to Draco. Unlike Draco's own mother, and most of the pure-blood witches he knew, Evangeline worked outside of her home. Before she'd returned to her father's country of Lithuania at the start of the war, she'd been a curator for magical texts in the wizarding section of the British Library. "Do you remember when she was killed, Amelia Bones?" Theo asked suddenly, looking at Draco as though only just now remembering that he was there. He frowned in concentration. "It was sometime around the start of our 6th year, wasn't it? Not the best of times for me, if I'm being honest." Theo nodded, then started speaking again so quietly that Draco nearly had a difficult time hearing him. "The summer before. Mum was torn up about it. I think she kind of blamed herself for what happened to Amelia." "Why?" Draco asked, entirely mystified. Theo stayed silent for so long that Draco wondered if he was going to answer at all. The dark-haired wizard moved from the doorway of the kitchenette, crossing to the cupboard and opening it to search before noticing the empty bottle of scotch on the counter. "Did you drink all this?" Sorry, mate, here. I bought another one at the off-license before I came back here." Draco summoned the half-full bottle and his own glass from the sitting room. Both men sat at the small table. He waited until Theo had filled his glass before tipping the bottle over his own. Theo took a large gulp of the scotch, grimacing at the burn of it before continuing. "After Mum divorced Tiberius, she and Amelia grew closer. Divorce is looked down upon in wizarding society, and there aren't many witches willing to associate with a woman who lost her husband, even if it was her decision to divorce. And I'm sure Mum's blood status didn't help." Draco nodded in understanding, taking a deep swig of his own drink. The dark-haired Slytherin continued. "After they divorced, when I was 7, Mum and Amelia started having dinner together more often, a few times a month, maybe once a week. I think Amelia was glad to have a friend to talk to. I guess they both were. It didn't matter the weather. After dinner they would sit out in the garden under some weather charms and build a fire, and drink wine for hours." Theo's eyes crinkled in a smile as they fixed upon the cupboard behind Draco, and Draco knew he was picturing this scene in his mother's beautiful garden in Coventry right then. "Mum and Tiberius were both friends with Kingsley in school, same house and all. We used to have him over for dinner a lot too, before the divorce. With Mum, not so much after," Theo said, and Draco nodded, recalling Shacklebolt's thoughts about Evangeline's suitability as the wife of a pureblood. "Anyway, for years, Mum and Amelia always avoided talking about Kingsley. He was one of the few subjects they disagreed on. Amelia knew that they had been close years before, but at the ministry Amelia was Kingsley's boss. Kingsley was the deputy under head Auror Scrimgeour, but she was the head of the entire department of magical law enforcement. When Amelia did mention Kingsley, it sounded as though they butted heads. Often she would say things like, 'He can't wait until I retire,' or 'He just wants to do things his way all the time, like he thinks it's his department or something.' And Mum would laugh about it and say something like, 'Oh, that sounds just like Kingsley.'" Right. Draco murmured his agreement. It did sound like the man that he'd begun begrudgingly spending time with over the last several months. "Amelia came by with Susan a couple of days after we arrived home from Hogwarts that summer, after 5th year. Susan and I had kind of a thing, off and on, and we snuck off after dinner behind Mum's greenhouses. Heavens angels, the pair of tits on her you would not believe, mate." "Focus, Theo," Draco reminded him with a twisted smirk. "What? Oh, yeah. Theo offered him an apologetic smile. So, Amelia and Mum, they built a fire, like they usually did, and as per usual, they started talking about the people they knew, their jobs and such. Only they didn't know that we were back behind the greenhouses and could overhear them. We stayed quiet because we didn't want to get caught out together, you know." Draco smiled with a knowing nod, swirling his scotch in his glass. Theo went on, "But this time, as they talked, Amelia seemed more, I don't know, scared?" "Of what?" Draco recalled hearing rumours of the gruesome details surrounding the death of Madame Bones, and the sudden thought of where Theo's story might go chilled him. "Well, you know, there was a lot of upheaval at the Ministry around that time. Fudge was getting called out in the press, by his enemies and his allies alike. He was taking heat for umbrage, plus for ignoring the fact that you-know-who was back and had broken into the Ministry. He was clearly on the way out as Minister for Magic, and a lot of people wanted Scrimgeour for the job. Scrimgeour was head Auror, a real tough-as-dragonhide, hard-ass kind of bloke, you know?" "Right. He had a reputation as a straight arrow, by the book type. Couldn't be bought. A lot of people we know didn't like that." Theo smirked. "I'm sure. In any case, Amelia knew that as the head of law enforcement it would fall to her to make the choice for the new head Auror, and ordinarily I guess the natural choice would have been the deputy head." "Shacklebolt," Draco murmured. "Right. Only Amelia didn't want him in the job. She had her reasons. They didn't get along. He was territorial and hot-headed. He didn't respect her authority as the department head." Draco frowned. "Well, she didn't name him as head, isn't that right? Robards was chosen instead." Theo grimaced. "Yeah, even though Kingsley had seniority. Because Mum told her Kingsley would be fine with it. She was sure he would be honoured to simply serve the Ministry no matter who was in charge." Draco huffed an unamused laugh. "And that was that? Bones just took your mother's word for it?" Theo's head hung low. "Not at first. Amelia, honest to God, she sounded ready to oust Kingsley altogether when they were talking. Said the Auror department was getting a shake-up, that perhaps it was time for new leadership, all the way down. She said she only worried about how Kingsley might retaliate if he didn't succeed Scrimgeour." Draco drained his drink and poured another, summoning Theo's glass to pour some for him as well. "The papers, they all said that you-know-who, or some of his people, did it." To be entirely honest, after it happened, Draco had been thankful that Lucius had been in Azkaban at the time, meaning that at least he hadn't been a part of the massacre at Madame Bones's house. Breaking into the Ministry had been enough of a blow to their family name. Killing a respected, pure-blood member of the Wizengamot and the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement was on a whole other level. "The papers said it was Voldemort because that's what the Auror office told them." Draco blinked at this. "But they investigated the murder, right?" Theo lifted a jaded brow at him. "Who do you suppose was the lead investigator?" "But surely—" Draco started, then stopped, uncertain of what he planned to say. "The papers said she died of an Avada Kedavra after a brief duel. They said she put up a strong fight, but did not suffer. That's what Susan said that Kingsley and the other Auror who came to their house told them as well." "I take it Susan thinks differently?" asked Draco. Theo looked at Granger's door once again to confirm that they weren't being overheard. To be doubly sure, Draco cast a second muffliato to strengthen Theo's earlier one. "The night her aunt died, Susan and her family were eating dinner, when her aunt's Patronus flew into the room. It said something, but they couldn't agree later on what it was. After they learned of her death, her parents insisted that the hawk must have said, 'Help me.' But Susan was closest, and she insisted that it said, 'Kingsley.'" Draco stared wide-eyed at the other man. "Did she tell her parents that?" "She did. But remember, her father Eugene was friends with Mum and Kingsley in school. When Susan tried to tell him, He said she was mistaken, or that if it did say Kingsley, his sister was probably intending to send it to Kingsley to summon him, because he was an aura, but she accidentally sent the Patronus to them instead. Convenient, Draco said, sipping his scotch thoughtfully. Very, Theo agreed, sharing a hard look with the other wizard. Then, a couple of days later, Susan saw the body, and that sort of confirmed it for her. Draco choked on his drink, sitting up in his chair in surprise. What? Yeah. Amelia, she didn't have elves. She didn't believe in keeping them, so it fell to the family to prepare the body for the burial service. Susan was the oldest, so she and her mum did it. Salazar, Draco said, leaning back in his chair in shock. She said Amelia had bruises around her neck. What? Draco asked, horrified. Theo grimaced, a far-away look in his eye. Yeah, a Vada Kedavra doesn't leave a mark, you know. So why would there have been bruises? Susan and I figured that whoever killed her didn't want to leave any sort of magical traces, so they strangled her instead. So how did the investigators explain the bruises? Susan said they tried to explain it away, something about the humours, the blood settling in the body. But how would blood settle in the shape of hands around a person's neck? Draco loosened his tie uncomfortably. So, do you really think Shacklebolt did it? I know that Susan and Mum talked at the funeral, and after that Mum started making plans for us to go to Lithuania. Before Tiberius went to Azkaban, he wouldn't have allowed me to go with her. But with him in prison, he had no say. Mum wanted us to go immediately, but I was in a strop about returning to Hogwarts. Susan was my friend, and she was in a right state. And I wanted to be somewhere familiar. I figured it would be all right, what with Tiberius locked away. When I went to visit Mum in Vilnius at Christmas, though, she convinced me to stay there, in Lithuania. She said it wasn't safe for me here. She was right, of course. Tiberius escaped a month later. If I had been in the country, he would have found a way to get to me at the end of 6th year, and forced me to join them. Draco nodded thoughtfully, knowing that that was entirely the case, as it had happened to him in just that way. Well, that explains your disappearing act. It was a surprise to everyone when you didn't come back after the break. Theo nodded with a sad smile. To me as well. Draco was lost in thought for a moment. But you didn't answer the question. Do you think Shacklebolt did it? I don't know for sure. I hope not. Amelia Bones was outspoken against Voldemort long before the night she died. I know she was a target for their side, but I can't help wondering if she was a target for Kingsley as well. Remember, there were all sorts of crazy things happening then. Giants, Dementors, murders, bridges collapsing. Perhaps he just took advantage of the timing, is all. Draco scrubbed at his face with his hands. I thought I left all of this nonsense behind after that bastard and his fucking snake died at Hogwarts. Theo finished his own drink and sighed. We all did, mate. He stood and walked slowly to the door of his room. Theo. The wizard turned back to face his oldest friend. Yeah? I can't let him. He won't hurt. Draco's voice cracked, unable to finish his thought aloud. I know, Drake. Theo's eyes flicked once more to Granger's door, before he closed his own, and Draco was alone. He picked up the Scotch glasses, and nearly put them in the sink with a washing spell, before remembering his apparent penchant for utter filth. Gods, what was he to do now? Before this, his biggest worry had been that he or his mother might be thrown in Azkaban, or that Granger might flunk out of magical law. Could Shacklebolt have killed Amelia Bones? Was the man capable of cold-blooded murder? Nothing about his interactions with the older Slytherin minister told him that this couldn't be the case. Draco wasn't willing to take the chance that Susan and Theo and Evangeline were all mistaken. His instinct to protect Granger was shifting into overdrive, but Shacklebolt had threatened his mother as well. Narcissa needed to be warned. An owl would take far too long to reach her, and because of his probationary status, their flu could not be connected to the Malfoy estate in Monaco. He closed his eyes and focused on clearing his mind. He had learned the spell and its uses in his 8th year at Hogwarts, but he'd only carried it off successfully a couple of times in class during their 8th year, and he'd never sent a message this way. In his mind's eye he pictured Granger, looking up at him here in his kitchenette tonight, but also on his 18th birthday, in that holding cell in the cellar of the Ministry for Magic. Everything around him, up until that moment of her arrival that day, had been dreary, hostile, even sinister. The guards had sneered at him, pushing him as he walked, treating him like a criminal during his search beforehand. At one point he'd stumbled as they pushed him along. The fall he'd taken whilst wearing the magical handcuffs had dislocated his shoulder, loosened a few of his teeth, and bloodied his lips. It took them over an hour to get around to finding a mediwitch to heal him. The whole time as his shoulder ached, he'd been imagining 50 years of this kind of treatment. Then she arrived, and with her came sunlight, hope, and seemingly endless possibilities, even as he still thought his future was doomed. She looked at him with those warm copper eyes, and she smiled that secret smile meant only for him to see. It had been, up until that moment, the happiest moment he'd ever experienced. In an instant, Draco had seen the possibility of a different life for himself, a life that he craved. And within a few hours, he had been given the glorious freedom to pursue that life. Expecto Patronum, he whispered quietly, clinging to the memory of that day. The silver light erupted from his wand, rearranging itself quickly into the shape of a handsome peacock, which strutted soundlessly over the mess of dirty socks and empty crisp bags. "Be certain that your wards are strong, Mother. Don't let anyone from the Ministry of Magic inside, unless they've given you written notice, and they've brought multiple people with them. Make sure there are always witnesses. I love you." The peacock slowly lowered his fan of silver white feathers and raced towards the window, disappearing quickly through the panes of glass as though they weren't there. Draco turned back to the sitting room that now looked dim and dingy without the peacock's brilliantly dazzling light. He grimaced at the ubiquitous mess and summoned a clean pair of joggers from his closet. Once ready for bed, he tossed and turned on the sofa for several minutes, raising his head to listen intently at every minute noise in the flat. Every creak of the settling building was Shacklebolt's crack of apparition into Granger's room where she slept. Every sigh was the witch's gasp beneath the minister's tightening grip on her neck. Dragging his blankets and pillow off of the sofa, he tiptoed closer to Granger's door, pressing his ear against it and listening to the perfect silence within the room for several seconds. Satisfied that she was safe, he then wrapped himself in the blankets, settling the pillow behind his back as he leant against the door, his ear pressed gently against it. There. Now he would hear instantly if something went wrong. When she woke in the morning, he would go back to the sofa as though nothing were amiss. At least here, closer to her, listening for her, he could rest. Hermione. Somehow, without even realizing it, she'd left the kitchenette and walked into her room, closing and locking the door behind her. She removed her outer robes and hung them up, changing out of her clothes and into her pajamas. After she had done this, she truly had no idea how and when she had accomplished it. Her brain was a vast, clanging void, inside of which 1,000 variations of the same thought seemed to collide like dodgems at a carnival. I kissed Draco Malfoy. She lay down on the bed, not even bothering to leave the room to brush her teeth. A cleansing spell would need to suffice for tonight. He was still out there, in the sitting room with Theo, and there was no way she could face him again so soon. What had she been thinking? Sodding hell, what had he been thinking? Was it just the scotch, or did some small part of him actually fancy her? Surely not. But it had been Draco who had approached her in the kitchenette. Draco, who had put his hands on the counter at her sides, capturing her between his arms. Draco, whose soft lips had alighted so tenderly upon her own, whose tongue had sought out hers. Draco, whose fingers had caressed her so carefully, as if afraid she might run. She could not help it. Her besotted smile overtook her face. It had to mean something, didn't it? But had he called things quits with Amelia? Would he tell Hermione how he felt now? These thoughts brought her up short. Did he feel anything? Was his kiss really the admission of attraction she'd been hoping for, or was it just a drunken snog? Her brain, which usually fought to process and analyze things from every angle before giving up, had relaxed. Just enjoy it, her mind tried to convince itself. So, she laid back on her bed and did just that. At some point, her thoughts slipped into restless, vivid dreams. He was in the bed with her, and his hands were everywhere on her body. There were no other words for it. It felt amazing. His lips were on hers again, then his mouth was kissing her neck and down her naked body. His warm tongue dipped into her wet, aching quim, caressing her clit and sending a thrill of sensation up her spine. She shivered as her entire body tingled in anticipation. She ran her hands through his soft blonde hair as his tongue dragged slowly over her most sensitive bits. "Draco!" she called in a high-pitched whine in her dream. "Granger!" Her dream-addled brain somehow managed to register the fact that he could not very well talk and use his mouth against her in that way at the same time, but her body was wound far too tightly to apply logic. "Granger, are you all right?" "Draco!" She was suddenly wide awake, sitting up in bed and panting, with the mortifying realization that she must have called out his name in a voice that sounded like she'd been about to climax. Which, well, she had been. "Granger, do you need help?" On the other side of the door, Draco sounded nearly frantic. Yes, her body wanted her to scream, still poised as she was on the edge of orgasm. "No!" she yelled breathlessly, racing towards the door to hold it closed in case the wizard unlocked it and came into the room on his own. She couldn't face Draco right now. If she did, she was entirely likely to attempt to climb him like a ladder and drag him into the bed with her, and that would not do at all. Because sometime in the dead of night, in that split second upon waking, the realization had come to her. She should not do this. Not with Draco. It was bad enough to kiss another woman's boyfriend, but on top of that, to purposefully develop a relationship with a close friend of hers was a mistake she only planned to make once in her lifetime. The way things had ended with Ron was a cautionary tale. She wouldn't do the same with Draco. She worked to calm her breathing, ignoring the electric sensation in her core. "Sorry, Draco, I'm fine. I was just having an odd dream. Go back to bed," she said through the closed door, struggling to keep her voice steady. After a moment or two of silence, she took her own advice and did the same, pressing the heel of her hand hard into her quim to relieve the ache in her center that longed for release. As much as she wanted the answer to be different, She knew that errant kiss in the kitchen had been a mistake on Draco's part, one that she would not take advantage of. She would need to do everything she could to make sure it didn't happen again. Monday, November 1st, 1999. The following morning, she opened the door to find Draco asleep, curled in front of her door. "Draco?" she asked faintly. "What's wrong? What are you doing here on the floor?" He sat up quickly, rubbing the grit from his eyes. "Apologies, Granger. My sofa was a mess. It just seemed easier to sleep here on this patch of floor, rather than clean it off." He yawned and rolled his shoulder, where it clearly ached from sleeping on the hard floor without a cushioning charm. "There's a solution to that, you know. Tidy up your mess," she offered playfully. "Where's your sense of freedom and joie de vivre, Granger? Let loose, yeah?" Draco replied jokingly. "I've got plenty of joie de vivre, Pratt, but sometimes you got to hoover and bin your rubbish," she said with a grin. Draco chuckled, then sobered. "Listen, Hermione, about last night. Don't worry about it, Draco. I get it." She cut him off, smiling ruefully at him. His silver eyes darted to hers. "What do you get?" "You were drunk. You weren't thinking straight, and you got carried away. It didn't mean anything." Hermione swallowed with difficulty. "Right?" Draco's eyes dropped, and he bent to gather up the blankets and pillows from the floor in front of her threshold. "Right. And don't fret. I'll not say a word to Amelia about it." "Amelia?" Draco's forehead furrowed in alarm for just a moment before smoothing. "Oh, right. Amelia, yes. Thanks, Hermione." "Call me Granger," she wanted to say, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. Instead, she nodded and moved past the wizard, hurrying into the washroom to get ready to face the day. Thank you for listening to Who Gives a Fuck About an Oxford Comma by Great78. If you enjoyed the story and would like to listen to more, please follow me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts by searching for Silver and Copper. Or you can find me under Great78 on Archive of Our Own.